Welcome to Interface Studies. My name is Saleh. In his 1931 essay, Unpacking My Library, the German writer and philosopher Walter Benjamin reflects on what it means to live among books. What begins as an account of unpacking a personal library slowly turns into a meditation on order, memory, and how knowledge takes shape through use.
I am unpacking my library. Yes, I am. The books are not yet on the shelves, not yet touched by the mild boredom of order. I cannot march up and down their ranks to pass them in review before a friendly audience. You need not fear any of that. Instead, I must ask you to join me in the disorder of crates that have been wrenched open, the air saturated with the dust of wood, the floor covered with torn paper, to join me among piles of volumes that are seeing daylight again after 2 years of darkness.
When he wrote these lines, he wasn't really writing about libraries in the narrow sense. He was describing something more general, deeply familiar: how order forms over time, not because it was imposed, but because it was lived with. In his account, collections don't begin as systems. They become systems through habit, repetition, and memory.
Every passion borders on the chaotic, but the collector's passion borders on the chaos of memories.
What looks like confusion from the outside is often history from the inside. Objects encountered, handled, misplaced, and rediscovered. The order is there, but it is tacit and embodied, learned by moving through it rather than naming it.
For what else is this collection but a disorder to which habit has accommodated itself to such an extent that it can appear as order?
On the other side, and in his words, the catalogue represents the opposite impulse. It's clean, abstract, and detached. It knows about things without having lived alongside them.
If there is a counterpart to the confusion of a library, it is the order of its catalog.
This tension that Benjamin identified reaches far beyond libraries or books themselves. It marks as a fault line that now runs through almost every digital interface we use. Over the past few decades, we quietly replaced one way of knowing with another. We moved from navigating information to retrieving it, from moving through space to jumping directly to a result, from living inside collections to querying them from the outside. Now, this shift wasn't ideological, it was practical. For example, as the web expanded, early directories struggled to keep up. Human categories grew deep and unwieldy. Browsing paths became tedious. And so we reached for something faster and more direct. And instead of walking the shelf, we typed into a box. Search didn't just speed things up, it changed the shape of interaction. Navigation, that is slow, exploratory, cumulative, gave way to retrieval, which is fast, targeted, and efficient. You no longer needed to know where something lived. You only needed the right word. And for many tasks, that was undeniably better. But something subtle happened along the way. When access became instant, we stopped passing through information on the way to what we wanted. Context, neighbors, and competing frames were bypassed. The answer arrived cleanly, efficiently, and appears to be alone. You got what you asked for, not the landscape it came from. This trade off is easiest to see at the scale of the web today. Google Search delivers ranked results stripped from their original context. You rarely see what sits beside a page, what arguments it responds to, or simply what it displaced. Multiple perspectives are flattened into a single ordered list, optimized for relevance and authority. The result is fast, but the terrain that produced it disappears behind the ranking function. This is the paradox of search. It optimizes for speed, but in doing so, it flattens the field that once gave answers meaning. So, what's special about the shelf then? An interesting argument comes from Italian philosopher Umberto Eco, who once described his anti library. These are the books he hadn't read, not as a failure, but as a tool. These unread books were visible reminders of what he didn't yet know. They shaped inquiry simply by being present. A shelf makes ignorance tangible. It surrounds what you know with what you don't. Discovery doesn't require a precise question. It happens through proximity, like noticing what sits next to what, by glancing sideways while looking for something else. On the other hand, search, and by extension, this LLM input box that we see in chat applications today, work differently. Search begins with a query, and the query already assumes knowledge: a name, a keyword, a prompt, a hunch. And even when modern systems add recommendations and suggestions, the structure remains target driven. You specify, the system delivers. And this is the key difference. The shelf, or the concept that it represents, supports encounters with unknown unknown. Search excels at retrieving the known unknown. This difference isn't philosophical, it's cognitive, and it is amplified by the screen itself, which must represent everything through the same narrow aperture. And with the exception of the returning world of spatial computing, we haven't yet solved how to recreate lived spatial context digitally. Now, human memory did not evolve to retrieve labels. It evolved to support movement through physical environments. Long before writing and indexing, we remembered places, paths, and relationships between things. In the 1940s, Edward Tolman showed that both humans and animals form cognitive maps. These are internal layouts of space organized by position rather than by name. Later, neuroscience made this literal. In the 1970s, John O'Keefe discovered place cells in the hippocampus. These are neurons that fire when an organism is in a specific location. Memory, turns out, is not just semantic, it is spatial. We often remember where something is before we remember what it is called. In a library, that memory is constantly reinforced. The history section is back and to the left. The book you want is near the red one. Repeated movement strengthens recall even when attention drifts. Over time, the space itself becomes an external memory, a stable scaffold that supports recall without conscious effort. The shelf takes advantage of this. It constantly lowers cognitive load. You don't need exact names. You retrace paths. Your hands know where to go before your mind does. Cognitive scientist Edwin Hutchins described this as distributed cognition, thinking spread across brains, bodies, and environments, rather than being confined to the head. Search-centered interfaces rely on a different cognitive bargain. They demand semantic recall, exact titles, file names, keywords, prompts, whatever it is. If a label is forgotten or not accurate, retrieval fails in some way. The object may still exist, but without the right term, it is effectively invisible. This fragility is well documented in computing. In the 1980s, George Furness described the vocabulary problem. People routinely use different words for the same thing. No single label reliably matches how user remembers an object. Keyword systems work only when system naming and human memory align. Classic computer interaction research also distinguishes between recall and recognition. We've seen that in the previous video about verbs versus nouns. As Don Norman argued, interfaces that rely on recall impose a heavier cognitive burden than those that support recognition. Remembering a name is harder than recognizing a place, a shape, or even a position. This does show in everyday computing. Tools like Spotlight work well when you remember the file name or content. This depends on you naming the files in the correct way or knowing something about them. But when recall fails, search offers little help. Now, you might know the file lived in a specific folder or corner of the desktop, yet the interface gives you no way to act on that spatial memory. This trade off was recognized early in computing. In the late 70s and early 80s, researchers explored alternatives that preserved spatial context. MIT's Architecture Machine Group built the Spatial Data Management System, or DataLand. It was a wall-sized information landscape where data lived in stable places. You didn't type a file name. You flew to the northwest quadrant where you left it. Fixed adjacency mattered. Placing a calculator next to a map meant seeing one could reliably bring you to the other. Design pioneer Jeff Raskin went further with the zooming user interface, an infinite plane where you can move from an overview to detail by zooming. It was the Archie project that I've covered before. Even search, which was in his Canon Cat project through the leap command, functioned as a traversal aid. You arrived somewhere with neighbors and coordinates, not at a sterile result. The classic Mac Finder carried parts of this spatial logic into everyday computing. That was through a set of strict and almost stubborn rules. Files and folders had one location at a time. Windows represented real places in a hierarchy. Icons remembered where they were left. To find something was often to retrace a path rather than to recall a name. Now, traces of this logic still exist today, but in a weakened form. Modern operating systems retain folders and paths, yet their spatial meaning is routinely bypassed by global search, recent file lists, cloud abstractions as well. Some of the features, like the places of icons on a desktop, still exist, although Apple continuously introduces features to clean them up, group them, stack them. Files can appear in many locations at once now. Windows no longer reliably map to places. The system still knows where things are, but the interface increasingly trains users not to care. What united these systems was not nostalgia or visual flair, but a shared interaction principle, or at least attempts of it. Information lived in stable places. Objects had a single location. To find something was to go there, not to describe it. Meaning accumulated through movement, not naming. Search existed, if at all, to travel within space, not to bypass it. But there was a problem. And most of these systems weren't naive, but they were expensive. They demanded care, maintenance, and time. The very costs retrieval-based systems were designed to eliminate. As information volumes grew, spatial organization became harder to sustain. Search succeeded because it outsourced organization to algorithms, and it actually delivered. It delivered results on demand. That trade made sense. The problem or the challenge isn't space versus search. It's what happens when either becomes total. Systems like Wikipedia reveal the same tension. You can arrive through search, jumping straight to the article. You can also navigate literally through links, categories, and references. Wikipedia homepage is a search page. There is a homepage that is navigation-based, but it's relatively simple. This knowledge base itself supports both modes, but the experience is radically different. Search delivers precision. Navigation reveals structure, disagreement, and adjacency. The interface quietly privileges one over the other. Now, information forging theory helps explaining why this matters. It was developed by Peter Piroli and Stuart Card. It describes how people follow information sent to maximize value per effort. Shelves provide rich scent. Neighbors, physical cues. Search compresses scent into titles and snippets. This is what takes us to talk a little bit about serendipity when it comes to information in general. In this case, serendipity didn't exactly disappear. It was just respecified. Information researcher Ellen Toms defined serendipity as encountering information you weren't seeking, but recognizing its value when you see it. Recognition depends on context. Shelves make accidents cheap. Search suppresses them. The loss here is not philosophical, it's almost statistical. Fewer chances to encounter outliers, fewer opportunities to reframe what matters. Today, generative AI complicates this a bit more. At first glance, large language models seem to restore serendipity. Ask a vague question and receive a rich, well formulated response. It feels like going through a shelf again. But the challenge is that this serendipity is synthetic. It's not environmental. The model produces associations without place. There's no periphery, no stable geography to return to. Discovery collapses into consumption. Users don't stumble upon information. They are presented with it. But the search bar isn't the enemy. Used deliberately, it can be humane. It excels when the goal is retrieval, when the question is already formed, when speed genuinely matters. The problem begins when search becomes the default way of knowing, when every interaction collapses into a prompt, when navigation, orientation, and context are treated as inefficiencies. What I'm arguing for here isn't a rejection of search or of generative systems, but a rebalancing. Search works best as an instrument, not a worldview. Spatial structure works best as a medium, not a burden. Because in the end, interfaces don't just organize information. They decide what kind of thinking is possible.